Welcome to Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting. Today, we're diving into a revolutionary moment that quietly changed how we understand the economy, not through riots or revolutions, but through an idea that challenged empires of thought and gave rise to a school of economic reasoning that still rattles cages today. So, here's the question. What if value doesn't come from how much labor you put into something, but from how much someone actually wants it? Let's rewind to 1871, in Vienna. At the time, economics was dominated by the German historical school, an approach that basically treated economies like massive data collections to be studied in hindsight, with theories buried beneath endless case studies. It was orderly, bureaucratic, comfortable. But Carl Menger wasn't comfortable. He saw something deeper. In his groundbreaking book, Principles of Economics, Menger didn't just tweak the rules, he tore them up. He introduced the concept of marginal utility, arguing that the value of something isn't fixed by its production cost or embedded labor. It's subjective. It changes depending on the individual. A glass of water is worth nothing in a flood, and everything in a desert. This flipped the old world on its head. Menger's insight shifted economics away from big, state-centered historical narratives and toward a science of individual choices, of causes and consequences at the micro level. Think of it this way. Instead of looking at history through the lens of kings and nations, Menger looked through the eyes of the people, each with their own goals, needs, and trade-offs. And that made all the difference. This was more than theory. It was a moral shift too. It placed the individual back at the center of economics, where they belonged. And this, right here, was the birth of the Austrian School. Now that we've seen how Menger laid the groundwork, let's move to the man who built the foundation into a fortress, Ludwig von Mises. Mises didn't just study economics. He redefined how we study human behavior itself. His method? Something called Praxeology. And trust me, it's more powerful than it sounds. Praxeology is the study of human action, not biology, not psychology, not groupthink. Just one thing, purposeful behavior. Anytime a person acts with intention, whether buying bread, building a factory, or quitting a job, they're engaging in praxeology's domain. And here's the genius of it. Rather than drowning in data and endless regressions, Mises starts with something we can all agree on: humans act. From that, he builds a logical structure, step by step, to understand the consequences of those actions. This stands in sharp contrast to the dominant methods in mainstream economics, which treat people like data points in a lab. Those approaches lean heavily on mathematical models, correlations, and historical averages, as if human beings were atoms in a physics experiment. But here's the thing. We're not atoms. We learn, we change, we anticipate, we make mistakes, and we act based on our unique knowledge and values. That's why Mises rejected positivism, the belief that economics should be purely empirical and modeled like the hard sciences. You can't prove human decisions in a lab the same way you prove chemical reactions. There's too much variation, too much context, too much soul. Praxeology, on the other hand, respects the integrity of the human mind. It recognizes that behind every economic decision is a thinking, valuing individual. And it starts from that rock-solid truth, without needing to bend reality into a formula just to publish another paper. In a world obsessed with big data, Mises' method might seem unfashionable. But maybe that's exactly why it matters now more than ever. By now, Mises had laid out a powerful framework for understanding human action. But he didn't stop at theory. He took that logic and lobbed a grenade into the heart of the 20th century's most seductive idea: central planning. You see, in the wake of World War I, socialism wasn't just trendy, it was practically treated as inevitable. Intellectuals, governments, and entire revolutions believed that if we could just eliminate private property and have the state run everything, we'd finally reach economic utopia. But Mises saw the flaw before the rest of the world paid the price for it. In his landmark critique, Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth, he delivered what is still the most devastating argument against socialism, not on moral grounds, but practical ones. Here's the core issue. Without private ownership of the means of production, there can be no real market for capital goods. And without a market, there are no prices. And if you have no prices, you can't know the relative value of anything. You're flying blind. Think about that. How do you decide whether to build a hospital or a factory? Whether to use steel for bridges or bicycles? Without real prices, generated by millions of voluntary exchanges, there's no way to make rational economic decisions. Everything becomes a political guess. Central planners, despite their fancy offices and committees, simply cannot replicate the spontaneous order of a free market. They can't track the real-time shifts in scarcity, demand, or innovation, so they guess. And the result? Shortages, surpluses, waste, misery. And here's what makes it even more stunning. Mises published this warning in 1920. That's decades before the collapse of the Soviet Union or the famine in Mao's China, or the dysfunction of Venezuela. He didn't need to wait for history to play out. The failure was already baked into the structure. Some tried to dodge the critique. They said, well, we can simulate prices, or we'll have a computer do it. But none of these schemes solved the real issue. Only genuine market prices reflect the dispersed knowledge of real people acting in real time. So when people today still toy with ideas of democratic socialism or planned economies, they're reanimating a zombie that Mises buried 100 years ago, with logic so sharp, no one has ever truly refuted it. Now if Mises was the hammer, Hayek was the scalpel. Friedrich Hayek took his mentor's insight and zoomed in on something most economists overlooked entirely: knowledge. Not the kind you get from a textbook or a census report, but the living, breathing knowledge scattered in fragments across millions of people's daily lives. Here's the problem with central planning. Hayek said, it's not just about prices, it's about what prices represent. Every time you make a decision, to buy, to sell, to wait, you're reacting to information no bureaucrat could ever hope to collect. The shortage at your local store, the preferences of your neighbor, the new supplier you found last week. It's tacit knowledge, subtle, contextual, and local, and it can't be bottled up into a spreadsheet. Prices, in Hayek's view, are not just numbers, they're signals. They communicate complex information in a beautifully simple way. If the price of copper goes up, it tells the world, copper is scarce. And without a single person in charge, entrepreneurs, manufacturers, and consumers all adjust. That spontaneous order. No master plan, no government blueprint, just individuals responding to incentives, adapting, correcting, and innovating on their own terms. Now contrast that with what central planners try to do. They imagine they can collect enough data, run enough simulations, and issue enough commands to steer an entire economy from the top down. Hayek called this the fatal conceit, the dangerous illusion that centralized authorities can know enough to control complex systems better than the people living within them. And once that control begins, it rarely stops. Because when the first policy fails, planners blame not the plan, but the people. They push further, more rules, more power, less freedom, until one day, you wake up on the road to serfdom. Hayek wasn't warning about some distant dystopia. He was describing a process we've seen play out time and time again, always beginning with good intentions, and always ending with lost liberty and broken systems. And what's the alternative? Let the market work. Let people decide. Let information flow freely through prices rather than choke behind bureaucratic bottlenecks. It's not chaos, it's order, just not the kind that comes from a command. Alright, now we arrive at one of the most misunderstood, and yet most powerful, ideas in Austrian economics, the business cycle. But not the version you hear from cable news or government economists. We're talking about the Austrian business cycle theory, and it flips the script on everything you've been told about booms and busts. Let's start with the basics. Most economists today think recessions just happen. Maybe it's consumer confidence, maybe it's oil prices, maybe Mercury's in retrograde. And when the crash hits, the usual response is, cut interest rates, print money, and stimulate demand. But Austrians see something different. They ask, why did we have the boom in the first place? And the answer? Artificially low interest rates, set not by the market, but by central banks. Here's what happens. When interest rates are pushed down below their natural level, below what real savings and time preferences would support, it sends a false signal to businesses. It tells them, hey, there's plenty of savings out there. Go borrow, invest, expand. So they do. Construction booms. Tech bubbles inflate. Stock markets soar. It all looks great for a while. But behind the scenes, it's all being built on sand. Because those low rates didn't come from real savings. They were conjured by monetary policy. So all those long-term projects, they're not sustainable. They're malinvestments. Eventually, reality catches up. The savings aren't there. Consumer preferences didn't change. The resources are misallocated. And then, the crash. Now here's the kicker. The bust isn't the problem. It's the cure. It's the market's painful but necessary process of correcting all the mistakes made during the fake boom. But what do governments usually do? They try to prevent the bust. They lower rates even more, print even more money, bail out the very sectors that misallocated resources. And in doing so, they kick the can down the road, making the next crash even worse. Sound familiar? Think of the Roaring '20s followed by the Great Depression, or the dot-com boom followed by the early 2000s crash, or the housing bubble and the financial crisis of 2008. In every case, the artificial boom came from manipulated interest rates and easy credit, and the bust was the inevitable correction. So while other economists scramble to explain why the economy keeps crashing, the Austrian school calmly points to the root cause: central banks distorting one of the most important prices in the entire economy, the price of time. Now you might be wondering, if these ideas are so logical, so grounded in reality, so right, Why don't we hear them more often? Why isn't the Austrian school front and center in every economics department and government advisory panel? Well, that's not by accident. That's history. After World War II, something dramatic happened in the world of economics. The academic spotlight shifted almost overnight from the Austrian school to a new hero of the age, John Maynard Keynes. Keynesian economics offered what governments craved: justification for spending. The promise that deficits didn't really matter, that the state could fine-tune the economy like a thermostat. It was a message tailor-made for politicians eager to do something, anything, and look smart doing it. And with Keynes came the institutional power. Universities redirected funding. Research journals raised the drawbridge. Central banks staffed up with Keynesian thinkers. If you didn't toe the line, you didn't get tenure, you didn't get published, and you didn't get heard. Austrian economists were effectively shut out, not because their ideas failed, but because they didn't serve the interests of the centralizing elite. No government wants to hear that it can't fix the economy with more spending. No academic cartel wants to be told their math-heavy models are disconnected from real human behavior. So the Austrians became intellectual outcasts. But they didn't vanish. Instead of relying on the ivory tower, they turned to the real world. They built networks of independent scholars, small presses, and think tanks. They wrote books, gave speeches, taught students one by one, passing the torch across generations. And here's the beautiful part: they survived because their ideas work. Because they speak to something deeper than trends or funding. They speak to the truth. Truth doesn't need institutional approval to be valid. It just needs to be seen. And over time, more and more people began to see it, especially after every economic crisis exposed the failures of the so-called experts who once mocked them. The Austrian school may have been pushed to the margins, but it never disappeared. It adapted, it persevered, and now, in the age of decentralization, it's rising again. At this point, we've covered theory, history, and critique. But now it's time to ask the deeper question: what's the human lesson here? Because the Austrian school isn't just about charts or interest rates. It's about people. It's about how real human beings interact, cooperate, and build civilizations, without needing someone at the top to command them. Here's the first big takeaway: voluntary exchange creates order. And not just economic order, but social harmony. When people trade freely, without force, they each walk away better off. That's not just efficient, it's moral. Now contrast that with systems built on coercion. Central plans don't ask, they demand. They override preferences. They punish deviation. And when things go wrong, and they always do, there's no accountability. You can't vote out a central planner you never elected. You can't sue a bureaucracy. Markets, on the other hand, have built-in feedback. A business that lies, cheats, or misallocates resources, it fails. A government agency that does the same, it gets a bigger budget. That's the asymmetry. Markets operate through consent. States operate, at best, through permission, and at worst, through force. And here's something else to think about: in a decentralized system, errors get isolated. They're painful, sure, but they're limited. In a centralized system, one mistake can wreck an entire nation. The stakes are higher because the control is concentrated. So yes, Austrian economics is about free markets. But underneath that is a much deeper idea: that freedom isn't just a luxury. It's a prerequisite for human flourishing. Because when people are free to choose, to act, to experiment, and even to fail, they grow. And society grows with them. That's the legacy. That's the lesson. And that's what makes this school of thought not just economically sound, but philosophically grounded. So now we ask the question that echoes through every crisis, every boom, every bailout, and every broken promise. What if we had listened? What if, instead of trusting central banks to manipulate interest rates, we trusted savers and investors to discover them? What if, instead of letting governments dictate production and subsidize failure, we allowed entrepreneurs to compete, succeed, and yes, fail, on their own merits? What if, instead of surrendering to experts with abstract models, we respected the knowledge held by real people in real time, expressed through real prices? Because history keeps showing us something uncomfortable. The more we centralize power, the more fragile things become. The more we plan from the top down, the more disconnected we get from reality on the ground. And when incentives are broken, when bad decisions carry no cost and good decisions get buried under red tape, systems rot. But the Austrian tradition offers an alternative. Not a utopia, not a promise, but a framework rooted in humility, realism, and freedom. It says, let people act, let prices speak, let knowledge flow freely, not through committees, but through signals and incentives. That's how you build resilient systems. That's how you preserve liberty. And that's how you avoid repeating the same mistakes over and over again. If this message resonated with you, if you felt that spark of clarity, that moment where the dots started connecting, then I invite you to take the next step. Like this video, leave a comment with your thoughts or questions. We read every one. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives like this. If you want the podcast version of this episode, it's linked in the description. And if you enjoy content that challenges mainstream narratives and brings historical truth to light, check out the other videos here on Truth Behind History. The stories are real, the impact is lasting.